The sound that stopped Jack Carter's heart wasn't an explosion or enemy fire. It was laughter, cruel, deliberate laughter, bleeding through the glass window of classroom 3A. And the moment he recognized his daughter's trembling silhouette standing alone at the front of that room, something inside him shattered in a way 6 years of combat never managed. Jack stood frozen in the school hallway, his service dog Rex pressing against his leg with that knowing weight, one scarred hand still wrapped around the door handle he'd been about to turn, when he shifted just enough to see through the classroom window. What he witnessed felt like taking shrapnel straight to the chest. There was Emily, his little girl, balanced unsteadily on her prosthetic leg, crutches gripped in white-knuckled hands, her small frame shaking with the effort of staying upright while her shoulders curved inward like she was trying to disappear. And standing directly in front of her, ruler extended like a weapon, was a woman Jack had trusted to protect his child. The teacher's face twisted not with concern but with theatrical disgust, gesturing at Emily as though she were an inconvenience rather than a student, a problem to be solved rather than a child who deserved patience. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed injustice and felt powerless to stop it? Drop a comment below sharing your experience. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this need to be told. Now back to what happened next. The teacher's voice cut through the glass, sharp enough that Jack could hear the mockery even without making out every word. She was performing for the class, her tone dripping with exaggerated frustration as she questioned whether the entire lesson should grind to a halt because one student, she gestured dismissively at Emily, couldn't manage basic tasks without slowing everyone down. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes finding sudden interest in their notebooks. But others laughed. Real laughter. The kind that builds on itself, encouraged by the teacher's raised eyebrow and knowing smirk, each wave of it making Emily flinch like she'd been physically struck until tears began carving paths down her flushed cheeks. Jack's jaw clenched so hard he felt his teeth grind. His mind flashed to firefights in distant deserts, to the honest brutality of war where enemies wore their violence openly. But this was something darker. This was humiliation disguised as education, cruelty masquerading as classroom management, and it was being inflicted on the one person in this world he had sworn to shield from harm, the daughter who had already survived losing her leg in the same accident that took her mother. Rex sensed the shift immediately, his ears pricked forward, muscles coiling beneath his fur, intelligent eyes locked on Emily through the glass as though calculating the exact distance between them and the child who needed them. Jack's breathing turned shallow, forced, deliberate. Every instinct screamed at him to crash through that door, but combat had taught him one unshakable truth. Observe before you act, gather intel before you engage, understand the battlefield before you make your move. Emily tried to answer whatever question had been thrown at her, her voice so quiet Jack couldn't hear it even standing this close. She shifted her weight carefully, and when her crutch slipped just an inch on the polished floor, the laughter surged louder instead of stopping, until the teacher snapped at her to stand up straight, as if that were something Emily's prosthetic leg and exhausted arms could simply choose to do. Something cold and final settled in Jack's chest. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't one bad day or a misunderstanding. This was a pattern, a daily ritual of degradation happening behind closed doors while parents trusted their children to this woman, while the community celebrated her tenure and dedication, while Emily came home quiet and withdrawn and Jack had assumed it was grief. The teacher was praised at parent meetings, respected at church functions, featured in the local paper for her commitment to excellence. And here she stood, systematically destroying a wounded child's spirit in front of an audience she'd trained to participate. Jack understood in that crystalline moment that walking away would be more than cowardice. It would be abandonment. It would be a betrayal worse than any order he'd ever refused, any mission he'd ever questioned. He took one step closer to the door, pulse hammering in his temples, not yet ready to reveal himself because a soldier knows that timing is everything, and a father knows when observation must end and protection must begin. The morning sun streamed through the hallway windows behind him, casting his shadow long and dark across the floor, and Rex pressed harder against his leg as if to say, "I'm ready when you are." Jack Carter made a silent promise to his daughter in that suspended moment, a vow that would shatter the carefully constructed lie this classroom had become. He didn't know yet that this decision would change not just Emily's life, but something fundamental inside himself. A piece of his soul that combat had broken, and this act of quiet courage would begin to repair. But he knew this, he was done watching. The door would open. Justice would walk in with steady footsteps and a service dog's unwavering gaze. And the laughter was about to stop. The morning had started like any other Wednesday, which was perhaps the cruelest part of what came after. Jack Carter pulled into the visitor parking lot of Riverside Elementary at exactly 10:47 a.m., early as always, because punctuality was a habit the military had beaten into him until it became reflex. Rex sat in the passenger seat with that patient dignity only service dogs possess, his amber eyes tracking the children playing on the distant field, tail giving one lazy wag when Jack reached over to scratch behind his ears. Emily's appointment had finished early. The prosthetic adjustment that was supposed to take all morning had gone smoothly for once, and Jack had thought, God, he'd actually allowed himself to think, that maybe today would be one of the good days. Maybe they'd grab ice cream on the way home. Maybe she'd smile that gap-toothed smile she used to give so freely before the accident took her mother and her leg in one terrible instant of twisted metal and screaming sirens. He'd texted the school office that he was coming. Protocol. Everything by the book because Jack Carter didn't do chaos anymore, not after 6 years of war had taught him that chaos was where people died and missions failed. Rex hopped down from the truck with practiced ease, the red service vest making him official, making him visible, making him the anchor that kept Jack tethered to this world on days when the past tried to drag him under. The school smelled like every school probably smells, floor wax and cafeteria mystery meat and the peculiar sweetness of construction paper and paste. Sunshine poured through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like nothing was wrong, like the world was still a safe place for little girls who'd already lost so much. A bulletin board near the entrance declared, "Every child matters," in cheerful die-cut letters surrounded by handprint rainbows, and Jack felt something twist in his chest at the sight. If you're a parent, you know that feeling when you walk into your child's school, that strange mixture of pride and vulnerability, knowing your baby is navigating a world without you there to shield them. Type, I understand, if you've ever felt that. He checked in at the front desk where Mrs. Henderson, the secretary who always remembered Rex's name, buzzed him through with her usual warm smile. The hallways were quiet, classrooms in session, the muffled sound of a teacher's voice explaining something about fractions floating from behind one door, children's laughter from another. Normal sounds, safe sounds, the kind that were supposed to mean everything was as it should be. Jack's boots made soft thuds against the linoleum as he walked toward Emily's classroom, Rex's nails clicking a counterpoint rhythm beside him, both of them moving with that synchronized precision that comes from years of depending on each other. He was thinking about her face when he dropped her off that morning, how she'd hugged him extra long, how she'd whispered, "I love you, Daddy," in that small voice that still carried traces of the fearless little girl she'd been before the world taught her to be afraid. He was thinking about ice cream flavors when he heard it. That sound. That terrible, careless laughter that would crack his world open and change everything that came after. Jack's hand found the wall before his knees could buckle, and Rex pressed against him instantly, that steady pressure that said, "Breathe, I've got you, breathe." But breathing was impossible because through the narrow window of classroom 3A's door, Jack could see his daughter, and what he saw made every battlefield memory fade into insignificance. Emily stood at the front of the room like she was on trial. Her prosthetic leg, the one they'd spent months adjusting, the one that had cost more than Jack's truck, the one she'd named Rosie because giving it a friendly name made it less scary, was locked at an awkward angle. Her crutches bore most of her weight, and Jack could see from 20 feet away how her small hands were shaking from the effort, how her knuckles had gone white from gripping the handles, how her shoulders were curved inward in that posture he'd seen on soldiers who'd taken too much fire and just wanted to make themselves smaller targets. Her left leg, her real leg, was trembling. Not from weakness but from the exhausting work of compensating, of trying to balance on equipment that would never quite feel like part of her body no matter how many fittings they did, no matter how many times the physical therapist promised it would get easier. The fabric of her uniform skirt bunched awkwardly where the prosthetic attached, and Jack could see the slight lean, the way her body constantly made micro-adjustments just to stay upright while everyone else got to stand without thinking about it. Have you ever watched someone you love struggle with something you can't fix for them? That helplessness that makes you want to tear the world apart? Comment below if you know that feeling. But it was her face that destroyed him. Emily's cheeks were blotchy red, tears streaming down in rivers she wasn't even bothering to wipe away anymore. Her bottom lip caught between her teeth so hard Jack was afraid she'd draw blood. She was trying not to sob, he could see that, trying to hold it together the way he'd taught her soldiers hold it together, but she was 9 years old and her body was betraying her and her teacher. The woman Jack had met at parent-teacher conferences, the woman who'd smiled and said Emily was adjusting well, was standing there with a ruler extended like a pointer, gesturing at Emily's leg like it was a prop in some cruel lesson. The other children's faces blurred in Jack's peripheral vision. Some looked uncomfortable, yes, but others were laughing, actually laughing, and each burst of it made Emily flinch like she'd been slapped. She tried to shift her weight, tried to adjust her stance to whatever impossible standard was being demanded of her, and the prosthetic made that soft mechanical sound it always made, the click and settle of metal and carbon fiber that Emily had once told him sounded like a robot was living in her leg. Her crutch slipped. Just an inch. Just enough to make her stumble slightly, to make her gasp, to make her reach out for balance that wasn't there. And instead of silence, instead of concern, instead of a single adult hand reaching out to steady a child who'd already fallen too many times in her short life, there was more laughter. Louder now. Encouraged by the teacher's raised eyebrow and theatrical sigh, Jack watched his daughter's spirit break in real time, and every instinct he possessed screamed one word: enough. Jack had been shot at in Kandahar. He'd pulled his best friend's body from a burning Humvee outside Mosul. He'd gone 3 days without sleep in Fallujah. Adrenaline and fear the only things keeping him conscious while mortars turned the night into a light show of death. He'd earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star, and there were scars on his back and leg that still ached when the weather changed, permanent reminders of the price he'd paid for wearing the flag on his shoulder. But standing in that hallway, watching through that window, Jack Carter would have traded every medal, every commendation, every moment of recognition for the chance to have never seen what he was seeing now. Because war, for all its horror, had rules. The enemy wore uniforms or they didn't, but you knew who was trying to kill you. Bullets didn't pretend to be something else. Explosions didn't smile and call themselves education. Violence in combat was honest about what it was: brutal, direct, survivable if you were fast enough or lucky enough or trained enough. This was different. This was poison dressed up as discipline. This was a predator wearing the mask of authority, inflicting wounds that would never show up on an X-ray but would live in Emily's mind for years, maybe forever. Jack had seen what happened to soldiers who internalized shame, who believed they were weak, who carried invisible injuries that everyone told them to just get over. He'd been to too many funerals that weren't caused by enemy fire but by the weight of believing you weren't good enough, strong enough, worthy enough to take up space in the world. If you've ever carried shame that someone else put on you, shame that wasn't yours to carry, type, "not mine" in the comments. Let's name that pain together. And Emily was 9 years old and already being taught that her body was a deficiency, that her struggle was an inconvenience, that asking for patience or understanding made her less than. The teacher was installing a program in his daughter's heart, writing code that would run in the background of every decision Emily made for decades. You're too slow. You're too much work. You don't deserve kindness. You're the problem. Jack had killed men who were less dangerous than this woman. He'd pulled triggers to stop threats that carried less potential for lasting damage than the words being spoken in that classroom right now. Because a bullet wound heals or it doesn't, but this kind of cruelty burrows deep, builds a home in your bones, whispers lies in your own voice until you can't remember what you believed about yourself before someone taught you to hate what you see in the mirror. In the desert, Jack had learned to identify enemy combatants by their actions, their weapons, their intent. Here, in this American elementary school with its cheerful posters and bright hallways, he was watching someone destroy his child with the same systematic efficiency he'd seen in trained soldiers. Except this enemy had tenure and a pension and a classroom full of witnesses she was training to become accomplices. Rex growled low in his chest, barely audible, and Jack's hand dropped to his partner's head, fingers curling in fur, grounding himself. Not yet. Observe first. Confirm what you're seeing. Make sure before you move. Because once he opened that door, there would be no going back, and he needed to be certain he understood exactly what kind of battlefield he was entering and what victory needed to look like when he walked out. It happened in slow motion, the way the worst moments always do, as if the universe wants you to remember every detail so you'll carry them forever like scars. Emily shifted her weight, trying to redistribute the burden her small body was carrying, trying to find some position that would satisfy whatever impossible demand was being made of her. The prosthetic made that sound again, that mechanical whisper that Jack usually found reassuring because it meant the equipment was working, meant Emily was mobile, meant she could run and play even if it looked different than it had before. But in that classroom, in front of those children, that sound became ammunition. Someone, Jack couldn't see who, made a robot noise, a mocking beep-boop that cut through the tension like a blade, and the laughter that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Emily's face crumpled, and she tried to adjust again, tried to show them she was trying, tried to be what they wanted even though her body was screaming and her arms were shaking and she'd already been standing there too long, far too long, longer than any adult would be expected to maintain that position without complaint. Her left crutch hit a spot on the floor that must have been just slightly slick, or maybe her grip faltered for just a heartbeat, or maybe her exhausted muscles simply gave out. It didn't matter why. What mattered was that the crutch slipped, sliding 6 inches to the side with a rubber squeak that was almost comical, except nothing about this was funny, nothing about this was anything except horrifying. Emily's eyes went wide, that flash of panic Jack had seen in soldiers' faces right before they hit the ground under fire, and she stumbled, her prosthetic leg unable to catch her weight, her body tilting dangerously to the left. She didn't fall, not completely, but she had to take a hop step on her real leg, had to flail for balance, had to make herself even more of a spectacle while trying desperately not to become one. Have you ever been laughed at when you were already at your most vulnerable? When you needed compassion but got cruelty instead? Share your story below. You're not alone. The laughter peaked. It rolled through that classroom like thunder, building on itself, kids feeding off each other's reactions and the teacher's theatrical sigh. And in that moment, as Emily finally regained her balance, her chest heaving, tears now flowing freely, her bottom lip trembling so hard Jack could see it from the hallway, the teacher spoke. "Emily, for heaven's sake, stand properly." The words were sharp, impatient. delivered with the kind of exasperation usually reserved for a child who was being deliberately difficult rather than one who was doing everything in her power to comply with the impossible. If you can't manage to stay upright, perhaps you should sit down and let the students who can focus actually learn something today. The teacher turned her back then, as if Emily's struggle wasn't worth her attention anymore, as if the little girl wasn't worth the effort of basic human decency, and that dismissal, that casual, careless rejection, hit Jack harder than any IED ever had. Because Emily's face in that moment, as she stood there shaking and sobbing and utterly, completely alone in front of 30 pairs of eyes, was the face of someone learning to hate herself, learning that her body made her unworthy, learning that asking for help meant she deserved punishment. Jack's vision tunneled. His hand found the door handle, and the promise he'd made in silence became a roar in his blood that demanded action, demanded justice, demanded that someone finally stand between his daughter and the cruelty this world seemed determined to teach her was normal. Jack's hand stayed on that door handle, frozen, while his mind moved at combat speed, processing everything he'd witnessed with the clarity that comes from years of making life-or-death decisions in seconds. This wasn't new. The realization hit him like a fist to the gut, stealing what little breath he had left. This wasn't one bad day, one mistake, one moment of a teacher losing patience. This was practiced, refined. A routine so established that the other children knew their roles, knew when to laugh, knew that their cruelty would be rewarded with the teacher's approving smile. Emily's quiet. For months now, maybe longer, Emily had been coming home quiet. He told himself it was grief, told himself she was processing the loss of her mother, told himself that withdrawing was normal for a child who'd survived what she'd survived. But now, standing in this hallway with his heart shattering into pieces too small to ever reassemble, Jack understood. She'd been coming home defeated. She'd been coming home carrying shame that didn't belong to her. She'd been coming home from a battlefield he hadn't known existed because he'd trusted the wrong people to keep her safe. The mornings made sense now. The way she moved slower and slower as they approached the school parking lot. The way she'd started asking if maybe she could be homeschooled and he'd laughed it off, said she needed to be around other kids. The way she'd stopped talking about her day when he asked. The way she flinched sometimes when he mentioned her teacher's name. All of it, had been Emily trying to tell him something was wrong without having the words for what was happening to her. If you've ever missed the signs that someone you love was suffering, type, "I see you now" below. It's never too late to start protecting them. Jack thought about the parent-teacher conference 6 weeks ago, how the teacher had smiled and said Emily was adjusting as well as could be expected given her challenges. As if Emily's prosthetic was a character flaw instead of evidence of survival. As if needing accommodations was something to overcome rather than a basic right. And Jack had nodded, had thanked her, had left that classroom believing his daughter was in good hands because why wouldn't he? Teachers were supposed to be safe. Schools were supposed to protect children. The system was supposed to catch this kind of poison before it had time to spread. But the system had a name, and she was standing in that classroom right now, turning away from a sobbing child like her tears were an inconvenience. The system had tenure and a pension and 23 years of experience that everyone praised at school board meetings. The system had parents who brought her gift cards at Christmas and principals who featured her in the district newsletter as an example of dedication to excellence in education. And the system was breaking his daughter one humiliation at a time, teaching her that she was less than, teaching her that her body made her unworthy, teaching her that no one would come to save her so she might as well learn to accept whatever cruelty was handed down from people in positions of power. Jack had walked away from firefights when ordered to retreat. He'd left men behind because the mission demanded it and returning would have cost more lives than it saved. He'd made impossible choices in impossible situations and lived with the weight of them every single day. But this This decision required no calculation, no tactical assessment, no weighing of outcomes. This was simple. This was fundamental. This was the difference between being a soldier and being a father, between following orders and following conscience. He couldn't walk away. Wouldn't walk away. Because if he left Emily in that classroom, if he let this moment pass without consequence, he would be teaching her the same lesson the teacher was. That she wasn't worth protecting, that her pain didn't matter, that the world would always choose comfort over justice. Jack Carter had failed many people in his life. He would not fail his daughter. Not today. Not ever again. The sound of the door handle turning was soft, almost polite, the kind of sound that shouldn't carry any weight at all in a room full of children and chaos and cruelty. But in that moment, that tiny click of metal and mechanism cut through the laughter like a blade through silk, and every sound in classroom 3 had died so completely it was as if someone had pressed pause on the entire world. Jack pushed the door open with the kind of controlled, deliberate pressure that came from years of breaching hostile spaces, slow enough to communicate he wasn't rushing, wasn't panicking, wasn't here to lose control. Rex moved with him in perfect synchronization, the way they'd moved through 100 situations where calm was the difference between life and death, the service dog's presence as much a statement as Jack's own. They crossed the threshold together, and Jack watched heads turn in sequence like dominoes falling, watched mouths snap shut mid-laugh, watched the teacher's hand freeze with her ruler still pointed at the whiteboard where she'd apparently moved on to teaching as if Emily's humiliation was simply handled business. The silence was absolute. 30 children who'd been making noise just seconds before now sat like statues, their faces reflecting various shades of shock and confusion and something that looked like relief on a few of the uncomfortable ones who'd never wanted to laugh in the first place. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, suddenly too loud, and somewhere down the hall a locker slammed, but inside this room there was only breathing and the soft click of Rex's nails on linoleum and the weight of Jack's presence filling every corner of the space. If you've ever walked into a room and made everyone stop and pay attention without saying a single word, you understand the power of presence. Comment, I felt that, if you know what I mean. Emily's eyes found her father's, and the expression that crossed her tear-stained face broke something in Jack's chest that had survived bullets and bombs and watching his best friend die. It was hope and shame warring with each other, hope that maybe someone had finally come to help and shame that she needed help at all, that she'd been struggling, that her father was seeing her at her most vulnerable and defeated. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, maybe Daddy, or maybe I'm sorry, or maybe just a sound that would explain all the mornings she tried to tell him and couldn't. But nothing came out except a small wounded sob that she tried desperately to swallow back down. Jack didn't look at the teacher yet. He didn't acknowledge the frozen classroom or the ruler still extended like evidence or the faces of children who were just beginning to understand that something significant was happening, that the unspoken rules they'd been following were about to be rewritten by someone who didn't care about their teacher's authority or their classroom hierarchy or whatever social structure had made cruelty seem acceptable. He walked straight to Emily. Each step measured, boots making solid contact with the floor, Rex matching his pace exactly, both of them moving like they owned the very air they breathed. Jack was still wearing his jacket from outside, still carrying the faint smell of cold morning and truck exhaust and the mint gum he'd been chewing on the drive over. He was still just a father who'd come early to pick up his daughter, still just a man in worn jeans and a service dog vest, but in that moment he was also every bit the soldier he'd been trained to be, and everyone in that room could feel the difference between a civilian entering a space and a warrior claiming territory that should have been sacred from the start. He knelt down in front of Emily, his injured knee protesting but his face showing nothing, and when he reached up to gently wipe the tears from her cheeks with his thumb, his hands were steady even though his heart was screaming. Rex settled beside Emily immediately, pressing his warm body against her trembling leg, his head tilting up to look at her with those amber eyes that had comforted Jack through panic attacks and nightmares and moments when the past tried to drag him under. And in that gesture, that simple act of a father comforting his child and a service dog offering silent support, Jack Carter made the first statement in what would become the most important battle of his life. Not with weapons or violence or rage, but with the quiet, devastating power of showing a little girl that someone finally believed her pain mattered more than the comfort of everyone who'd chosen to ignore it. Jack spoke to Emily first, and his voice was so gentle it made the preceding cruelty seem even more monstrous by comparison. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, his thumb still tracing away tears that kept falling no matter how hard she tried to stop them. "You're so brave. You're so brave, and I'm so proud of you. You didn't do anything wrong. Not one single thing. Do you hear me?" Emily nodded, her whole body shaking, and she collapsed against him, her small arms wrapping around his neck like he was the only solid thing left in a world that had turned hostile and unpredictable. Jack held her for a moment that lasted forever and not nearly long enough, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other steadying her against him while Rex pressed closer, completing a protective circle around this child who'd been standing alone for far too long. He breathed in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the salt of her tears and the faint smell of the prosthetic silicone liner, and he made another promise in the silence of his own mind. She would never stand alone again, never doubt her worth again, never believe that her struggle made her less than anyone else in this room or any other. When he finally, slowly stood back up, and it took effort because his body wanted to stay right there, wanted to build a wall between Emily and everything that had hurt her. He kept one hand on her shoulder, anchoring her, reminding her he wasn't going anywhere. Only then did he turn to face the teacher, and the expression on his face was something the children would remember for the rest of their lives even if they couldn't quite name what they were seeing. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. It was something colder, more final, more absolute. It was judgment delivered without words, condemnation carried in the steadiness of a gaze that had stared down actual enemies and found them more honorable than this. Have you ever seen someone stand up for what's right with such quiet power it changed you? Tell us about a moment when someone's courage inspired you. Drop it in the comments. Repeat what you just said to her. Jack's voice was conversational, almost friendly, except for the weight underneath it that made the air in the room feel heavy, hard to breathe. "I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Tell me again what you said to my daughter." The teacher opened her mouth, closed it, her face cycling through confusion and indignation and the first flickers of genuine fear as she realized this wasn't going to be handled the way things were usually handled, with polite conversations in offices and carefully worded emails and problems swept under rugs to preserve reputations. I don't think you understand the situation," she started, trying to reclaim authority, trying to position herself as the reasonable adult being unfairly challenged. But Jack raised one hand, not aggressively, just enough to pause her, and the gesture was so controlled, so measured, that it somehow carried more authority than any shouting could have. "I understand perfectly," Jack said, and now he addressed the entire room, his eyes moving from child to child, making contact, making sure they heard him, making sure they understood that what he was about to say mattered more than any lesson they'd learned from a textbook. Real strength isn't about making fun of someone who's already struggling. Real strength is what my daughter shows every single morning when she wakes up and faces a world that isn't built for her body, when she straps on equipment that hurts, when she practices walking on legs that don't match, when she comes to school knowing she'll have to work twice as hard as everyone else just to keep up. His voice never rose, never wavered, but every word landed with the force of something that had been forged in fire and tested under pressure and found unbreakable. And authority without compassion isn't authority at all. It's just cruelty with permission. It's just someone who has power using it to make themselves feel big by making someone else feel small. He paused, let that sink in, watched the teacher's face drain of color as she understood that this man wasn't going to be intimidated or redirected or convinced to handle this quietly. My daughter deserves better. Every child in this room deserves better. And if you can't see that, then you have no business teaching anyone anything about anything. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of 30 children processing what they'd just witnessed, recalibrating their understanding of right and wrong, learning in real time that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is name cruelty when you see it and refuse to call it anything else. The change started with a boy in the front row, maybe 8 years old, with freckles across his nose and a superhero backpack hanging on his chair. His face had been alight with laughter just minutes before, but now it crumpled in on itself as understanding hit him like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said, his voice cracking on her name, and the words came out choked with tears he was trying not to shed because boys his age still believed crying was weakness, hadn't yet learned that remorse is one of the most courageous emotions a human being can feel. "I'm really, really sorry. I shouldn't have laughed." And then it spread like wildflowers after rain, one apology blooming into another until the classroom was full of small voices saying, "I'm sorry," and "I didn't mean it," and "Are you okay?" Children who'd been trained to follow their teacher's lead were suddenly following their own hearts instead, and Jack watched 30 kids learn in real time that just because an authority figure does something doesn't make it right, that laughing along with cruelty doesn't absolve you of participating in it, that changing your mind when you realize you've been wrong isn't weakness but the foundation of everything good humans are capable of becoming. A girl with braids raised her hand like she was in class, realized how absurd that was and spoke anyway. "Emily's really nice. She always shares her snacks with me." Another child added, "She helped me with math last week when I didn't understand." And then they were all talking, all remembering who Emily was when she wasn't being made into a spectacle, all recognizing that they'd allowed someone else's cruelty to override their own knowledge of who she really was. If you've ever had to apologize for going along with something you knew was wrong, type "I learned" below. Growth starts with admitting we made a mistake. Emily was crying again, but these tears were different, softer somehow, the kind that come when pain starts to transform into healing. She was still pressed against her father's side, still trembling, but her shoulders had started to relax, her breathing had begun to even out, and when she looked around at her classmates' faces, really looked at them, she saw something she hadn't seen in months. She saw them actually seeing her. The classroom door opened again, and Principal Hayes walked in with the stride of someone who'd been summoned by an emergency but wasn't quite sure what kind. She was mid-sentence, already preparing to smooth things over, already wearing that professional smile that principals use to de-escalate situations, when she actually looked at the scene in front of her and stopped mid-word. Jack standing at the front of the room with Emily tucked against him and Rex sitting alert beside them. The teacher backed against the whiteboard with her ruler now hanging limp at her side. 30 children with tear-stained faces and guilt written across their features. "What's going on here?" Principal Hayes asked, but her voice had already shifted from professional concern to genuine alarm because whatever had happened in this room, it was clear that the normal rules and procedures had been shattered beyond repair. Before the teacher could speak, before she could craft a version of events that positioned herself as the victim or the misunderstood educator just trying to maintain standards, a dozen children started talking at once. The truth spilled out in fragments and overlapping sentences, kids talking over each other in their urgency to confess what they'd witnessed and participated in, to make sure the adults understood that their teacher had been mean, had been making Emily cry, had been doing this for a long time and they'd been too scared or too confused or too convinced it was normal to say anything before now. Principal Hayes' face went pale as the story assembled itself from 30 different perspectives, and Jack watched her professional composure crack to reveal something raw underneath, horror and maybe shame that this had been happening in her school, under her watch, while parents trusted her to keep their children safe. She looked at the teacher, then at Emily still shaking against her father's side, then at Rex whose presence suddenly made perfect sense because of course this child needed a therapy dog. Of course she needed every ounce of support she could get just to survive what should have been a safe space. "My office," Principal Hayes said to the teacher, and her voice carried no room for negotiation, no space for excuses, just two words that meant accountability had finally arrived, late but not too late because Emily was still here, still standing, still salvageable if they acted now. Now. The teacher opened her mouth to protest, but Jack's steady gaze stopped her, and she walked out of that classroom carrying the weight of every moment she'd chosen cruelty over compassion, every laugh she'd encouraged, every tear she'd caused and called discipline. The door closed behind them and the room exhaled as one. Jack waited until the substitute teacher arrived before he gathered Emily's things, carefully folding her jacket and placing her books in her backpack with the kind of attention to detail that spoke louder than words about how much he valued every part of her, even the small things, even the ordinary things. Emily stood beside him, still shaky but standing straighter now, and when a few of her classmates approached to say goodbye, real goodbyes, the kind that carried promises to be better friends, to be braver next time, she managed a small smile that made Jack's chest ache with pride. Outside the principal's office, they could hear raised voices, the teacher's defensive tone meeting Principal Hayes' unwavering insistence that this behavior was unacceptable, that there would be an investigation, that parents would be notified, that consequences would follow. Jack didn't stop to listen to the details because none of it mattered as much as the little girl holding his hand, the one who'd survived so much and would survive this too, stronger for knowing that someone had finally stood up when it mattered. They walked down the hallway together, Jack and Emily and Rex, and the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows felt different now, warmer somehow, like the world had shifted just slightly back toward the way it was supposed to be. Emily's crutches made their familiar rhythm against the floor, but she wasn't trying to hide the sound anymore, wasn't shrinking into herself with every step. She was walking like someone who'd remembered she had nothing to be ashamed of, like someone who'd just learned that her father would move mountains to protect her, that her struggle didn't make her less but made her remarkable. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever had to stand up for someone who couldn't stand alone, or if you needed to hear that someone would stand up for you, comment "Courage Matters" below. Let's build a community that chooses compassion. They pushed through the front doors, and the cool air hit them like a baptism, washing away the heaviness of that classroom, carrying with it the promise of healing that doesn't happen overnight but starts with one brave decision to say enough. Rex wagged his tail, sensing the shift in both of them, that lightness that comes when you stop carrying weight that was never yours to carry in the first place. Jack knelt down again, not caring that his knee protested, needing to be eye level with his daughter for what he was about to say. "Emily, I need you to hear something, okay?" She nodded, her eyes still red-rimmed but clearer now, focused. "What happened in there wasn't your fault. Not any of it. Not the laughing, not the cruelty, none of it. You are brave and strong and wonderful exactly as you are, and anyone who can't see that isn't worth your tears. Do you understand me?" Emily's bottom lip trembled and fresh tears spilled over, but these were the kind that heal instead of hurt, the kind that come when someone finally says the thing you've needed to hear for so long you'd almost stopped believing anyone would ever say it. "I was so scared, Daddy," she whispered, and the admission was like watching armor crack and fall away. "I didn't want you to know I couldn't handle it." Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough to remind her she was safe, gentle enough to remind her she was treasured. "Baby girl, asking for help isn't weakness. Surviving what you've survived and still showing up every day, that's the bravest thing I've ever seen. Braver than anything I did in any war. You're my hero, Emily. You always have been." They stayed like that for a long moment, father and daughter and service dog forming their own small unit of unconditional love and protection. And when they finally pulled apart, Emily was smiling through her tears, that real smile Jack had been missing, the one that lit up her whole face and reminded him why he'd survived everything he'd survived. For this, for her, for moments when choosing courage over comfort actually changed someone's life. They walked to the truck together, and Jack let Emily control the radio on the drive home, and when she asked if they could still get ice cream even though she'd been crying, he said yes because brave people deserve ice cream, and she was the bravest person he knew. Rex settled in the back seat with his head on Emily's lap, and through the rearview mirror Jack watched his daughter finally relax into the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're not alone, that someone sees your struggle and calls it strength, that love means showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The teacher was removed from her position 3 days later, quietly reassigned pending a full investigation that would uncover years of similar complaints that had been dismissed or buried or explained away. Emily would need time to heal, would need therapy and patience and countless reminders that she was enough just as she was, but she would heal because she had someone fighting for her now, someone who understood that sometimes the bravest thing a veteran can do isn't fight a war overseas but stand up in a classroom and say enough, this child matters, all children matter, and cruelty will not be tolerated no matter who's inflicting it or what titles they hide behind. Jack learned something that day too, something that would reshape how he understood his own strength and purpose. Protecting Emily hadn't just saved her, it had saved something in him, some piece of his soul that combat had fractured and compassion had begun to repair. He'd spent years believing his value came from what he could survive, what he could endure, how much pain he could carry alone. But standing up for his daughter had taught him that real courage isn't about suffering in silence. It's about speaking up when silence would be easier, about choosing love over fear, about using whatever power you have to shield someone who needs shielding even if it means making yourself vulnerable, even if it means admitting you should have acted sooner, even if it means facing the parts of yourself that failed before you found the strength to stop failing. And as they drove home with the windows down and the sun on their faces and Emily singing along to the radio with Rex harmonizing in soft woofs, Jack made one final promise. He would teach his daughter that her worth wasn't measured by how easily she fit into a world that wasn't built for her, but by how beautifully she persisted in demanding that the world make room. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never forgot it. This story moved millions because it reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a father kneeling beside his daughter and saying, "You matter." If this touched your heart, show it with a like, drop a comment sharing how this made you feel, and subscribe so you never miss stories that remind us what it means to stand up for what's right. What would you have done in Jack's position? Tell us in the comments below. Your story matters too.